This is the moment I bought the cheapest, clean title, non-running, twin-turbo 300ZX in the country. This Z was left abandoned since 2016 where it was hard parked after it developed some issues with the turbos and the injectors. Then someone started stripping it apart and never fixed it. Since then I was able to get it started. But that didn't mean it was finished. I pulled the engine, and today we're gonna continue rebuilding it to hopefully make it better than it was when it was new. So today we're gonna pick up where we left off, we're gonna finish a few things on the engine block, and start to finally rebuild this thing. The last thing we need to do on the engine block is remove the front and rear main seal. The rear main seal is held in with a retainer, and once I got the retainer off, the seal came with it, and I had to hammer out the rear main seal. And if you guys remember in the last episode, we ended up taking the heads to a machine shop just to make sure they were absolutely perfect. And I just got the call that they're ready to go, so we're gonna go pick those up. I ended up finding a local machine shop here that did it for $185, and I think it was money well spent. The heads on a car are usually the first to warp, and since they're made of aluminum, they're less durable and can end up with imperfections a lot easier than the block. So they hot tanked and cleaned them, and then they milled a few thousandths of an inch off the top to make sure it was perfectly flat and gonna give us the best seal. They also vacuum test them, so we know that the valves are sealing good, so we know we don't have to lap the valves, but we are gonna replace the valve seals since they are probably original with the car. This isn't a super difficult process, but it does take a lot of time. I got this special tool that's gonna help us get the valves out. And the first thing that we need to do is lube everything up. Then we place the bucket in the head where the lifter would normally go. And then we're gonna use these two bolts that are gonna compress down the valve spring. Once we have the valve spring compressed, we can remove the keepers. And sometimes you gotta give it a little tap just to release these keepers that have been in there for a long time. And then you can use a magnet to fish them out. Then from there, we're gonna remove the valve tool and the bucket, and we can retrieve the top hat and the spring. Once the top hat and the spring are out, we're gonna use these special pliers. These are gonna make it a lot easier to get the valve seals out. And we just clamp onto the valve seals, twist and turn until the valve seal comes out. These things were hard as a rock, so it's a good thing that we're replacing them. And with the new seals, we're gonna dip them in oil and just put them back in using the plier. And you wanna make sure these are fully seated. You can use a pick tool to measure the distance between the valve guide and the valve seal. And once it's completely closed, you know the valve seal is completely seated, and now we can reassemble. Since these heads were hot tanked, I'm gonna go ahead and lube up all the pieces that I'm putting back. That way we don't have any metal on metal contact when we do the first start. Now we can reinstall the bucket and the valve tool so we can compress the valve spring and give us enough space to get the keepers back in. And this is where things get a little tricky, especially if you have fat fingers like me. But if you use some magnets and some pick tools, you can get the keepers back in place to make sure that the whole valve assembly is completely secure. And once you have the keepers back in, you can finally remove that valve tool for the last time and move on to the next valve and do this again for 23 more valves. So as you can see, the process isn't that difficult, but it is gonna take some time to get all 24 valves done. So now the valve seals are done, we can go ahead and prep the engine block for the new heads. I'm blowing out all the holes and galleys with compressed air and a little bit of brake clean, and then I'm threading it in and out of all the threads in the engine block. This is to make sure there's no debris that's gonna affect the torque rating and that we're not compressing any fluids. And next we're gonna wanna use acetone and clean it really, really well so that the gasket will stick to the block. And you're gonna wanna keep going over this until no residue comes up on your rag. I'm using a lint-free rag here, and I must have gone through this maybe 4 or 5 times before the rag came up clean. And then we want to do the same exact thing to the head and blow out any debris from the machine shop and take off any of the oils. Now since these heads are really heavy, we're going to want to make sure we get some protein in before we take on that heavy load. Today's lunch is an Australian Wagyu New York strip. I'm just going to hit it with a heavy coat of salt on both sides. And for me, the most important part of a steak is the sear. So I'm using my perfect sear here to make sure I get all the fat perfectly charred up and no bald spots. And as you can see, this is a steakhouse quality steak. We slice into it like butter and it's perfect medium rare on the inside. I'm just throwing this down on top of some fresh arugula on some toasted bread to make a little sandwich. That brings up today's sponsor, Perfect Sear. If you love making steaks or barbecuing in your backyard, you're gonna need one of these. It's great for lighting charcoal, searing up steaks, chicken, or whatever you put on the grill. So if you want to support the page, make sure you go to chefjoni.us.com. Buy one and keep these builds going. Now I'm gonna show you an old mechanics trick that's gonna help make sure that you get your heads lined up with the block perfectly and you don't damage the head gasket or drop your heads. And all you need to do is go steal 2 of your wife's Stanley Cup straws. All you need to do is take your straws and put them in where the head bolts go on each corner of your block. And then you're gonna level the side of the block that you're actually putting the head on to avoid any oil from the bolts dripping into the seal area and to make it easier to set them on. Usually when you're putting heads onto a block, you can't really see where you're going. So you're gonna slip the straws through the holes into the head and it's gonna help you line them up perfectly and get the heads right onto the block with no mishaps. I did buy brand new OEM head bolts, and as you can see, 7 of the 8 are all the same length and 1 of them shorter, so we're gonna wanna make sure we pay close attention to that. And then to make sure that we get the right torque number, we're gonna oil up the washers and we're gonna put a little bit of lube onto the bolts. And then from there, I'm gonna put each one in and I'm gonna get it hand tight. And then we're gonna refer to the factory service manual for the proper torque settings. On this head, you're gonna do it in 2 stages. Once you get them all hand tight, we're gonna torque them down to about 29 foot-pounds, and we're gonna follow the order from the factory service manual. Once we have the first stage complete, we can go to the final stage, which is 90 foot-pounds. But then unfortunately, we have to loosen everything back up and redo the torque stages. And if you've ever torqued down head bolts, this is actually a really good workout. 90 foot-pounds is enough to get a little bit of sweat going and get you out of breath. And now we're gonna go on and do the other side, repeating the same exact process of torquing them all down, loosening them, and then torquing them down again. Take your time with this process. It's one of the most important processes in rebuilding an engine. And now we can place in those lifters that we rebuilt in the last video that have been soaking in oil ever since. And now it's time to put the cams back in. We're gonna lube up all the journals for the cams. That way we don't have any metal on metal contact, and also put a little bit of oil on top of the lifters. And now we can start off by putting the intake cams in.
It was at this moment that he knew. He fucked up.
So as soon as I set the cam in, something didn't feel right. And then when I put the cam caps back on, as you can see, they were sitting a little bit high and I knew something wasn't right. And I know sometimes this can happen when you have hydraulic lifters and you can just walk the cam down as you torque it. But I knew it was just sitting way too high. So after doing some research, I realized I made some big mistakes when I rebuilt the lifters. So we're gonna have to take all the lifters back out and fix them. So I pulled out all the lifters because basically what I ended up doing was I overfilled the lifters so they weren't seating all the way down. So now we have to disassemble them and bleed out some of the oil. And this is gonna leave some air inside of the lifters, but when you start the car, it should be able to bleed out the air on its own. And the risk of having air or underfilling your lifters is that they'll make noise. But if you over pump the lifters, what'll happen is it'll actually hold your valves open so you'll have no compression. So I figured the risk of underfilling is a lot better than the risk of overfilling. So that's why we're going through and fixing this. And now that we have the proper amount of oil in the lifters, we can go ahead and place them back in the heads. And unfortunately, this is just part of the process when you don't really know what you're doing and you're doing stuff for the first time. So we're learning lessons, but also this is why we take our time and we do our research when stuff doesn't feel right so that we can fix our mistakes. With our mistake fixed, we can put the cams back in and now they're sitting a lot better with the cam caps. But one thing I did notice with the cam caps is some of the bolts were hard to turn and some of them were in there nice and free. And what I discovered is the bolts kind of get seized in there from sludge and dirt. And to make sure that we get these torqued down properly, I sprayed them with WD-40 and I took my impact and I got them spinning nice and free before I put the cam caps back on top of the cams. And the last step before we torque down the cams is we actually want to apply a little bit of RTV to the front cam cap because there is a little oil passage in the front cam cap that we want to seal up before we torque it down. And then since these cams are hardened, we want to be careful when we torque them down. We want to do it in stages. So I started off by going about hand tight, and then I torqued it down to about 4 or 5 foot-pounds. And then the last one, I did the final torque value to 8 foot-pounds. It's super easy to over torque these, so I was extra careful. And after I cleaned up the valve covers, I noticed they were definitely in need of some love. So we're gonna go ahead and strip these down and refinish them. I got this sandblaster off of Temu that actually connects to my pressure washer, and I'm using this Quikrete sand to actually blast it. So I filled up a Home Depot bucket, and then I assembled the sandblaster and I got it connected to my pressure washer. This thing made very quick work of stripping down the paint. It maybe took me 1 or 2 minutes per valve cover to get them all cleaned up. And then I just gave them a nice rinse down to make sure I got all the sand out of them. And as you can see, the finish on them is great. I could probably put them on like this, but I think we're gonna refinish them in wrinkle black. So we're gonna be deleting the PCV valves from this car. So we have to plug up the ports on the valve covers before we refinish them. And so I'm gonna do that with these 5/8 freeze plugs. I applied a little bit of RTV to them. And once I had it placed in the right spot, I went ahead and tapped it in. I did the same exact thing to the other port. And here you can see, no more PCV. Then I went ahead and masked them all off and wiped them down with acetone, and now it's time to paint them. I'm using this VHT Wrinkle Black. We're gonna do 3 very heavy coats. You need the heavy coats to get the proper wrinkle finish, but the first one we're going side to side, and then I waited about 5 to 10 minutes, and I did another coat up and down. And for the final coat, I just went diagonal. And after 3 heavy coats, I went ahead and used my Harbor Freight heat gun to apply some heat to this. The heat is gonna help the wrinkles develop. You can let it air dry or you can bake it in an oven, but the heat gun is the best method. And as you can see, the wrinkles are already starting to form. And now that they're dry, we can test fit them on the engine, and man, do these things look good. So at this point, we have a bunch of parts on order. A lot of them are coming in. The main thing we're waiting for right now is the turbos. So at this point, I think it's a good stopping point for the week. So if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe, drop a like on the video, and I'll see you guys next week.